the ways in which people report encountering beings in psychedelic trips. These seem to be other entities, beings, something outside the person's own mind that was autonomous and nonetheless able to interact with them.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
Greetings. In this episode, we're venturing into a realm that straddles the line between the mystical and the controversial. We'll be talking about the use of entheogens, that is, hallucinatory substances, within Christianity. These psychoactive substances, often derived from plants, have been used throughout history to induce spiritual experiences, helping the mind rise above the ordinary and, as some would explain, touching the divine. But the question is, what happens when these ancient practices intersect with the tenets of Christianity? And as we delve into this topic, it's crucial to understand the historical context. Entheogens have been used in various religious traditions for millennia. From the ancient shamanic rituals of indigenous tribes to the mystery religions of ancient Greece, these substances were believed to facilitate direct communication with divine, offering insights, healings, spiritual revelations even. But Christianity, on the other hand, has a more ambiguous relationship with entheogens. While there's no direct evidence that early Christians used such substance, some scholars suggest that certain sects or mystics might have incorporated them into the practice. And that question is tantalizing. Could these substances have played a role in the ecstatic visions and profound spiritual experiences documented in early Christian thought? And there's no doubt in my mind that it raises significant theological questions. Christianity has emphasized a relationship with God through faith, prayer, guidance of the Holy Spirit. And the use of entheogen would be seen as a shortcut to spiritual enlightenment. Moreover, there's the ethical dimensions to consider, the potential for misuse, the risk of harm, should always be weighed against any purported spiritual benefit. We cannot ignore the modern resurgence of interest in entheogens, even among some Christians. This movement seems to be driven by anecdotal reports of profound spiritual awakenings, healings from trauma, and a deepening sense of connection with God. These experiences challenge the conventional boundaries of Christian practice, and it may even lead us to reconsider the role of altered states of consciousness in the spiritual life. Now, research into substances like psilocybin and ayahuasca have shown promising results in treating mental health conditions and facilitating transformative experience. While the scientific community approaches these substances with caution, the potential therapeutic benefits should not be dismissed outright. And this scientific inquiry might inform a more nuanced Christian response. So the question now is, where does that leave us? This intersection of entheogens and Christianity is complex. It's multifaceted. It's a deep-seated issue, and it demands careful consideration of the historical or theological and even ethical dimensions. While I personally am agnostic to the idea of entheogens or psychedelics used within any religious experience, the truth is out there, and it's up to us to seek it with open hearts and minds. The dance between the sacred and the mysterious continues, casting its light and shadow over our understanding of faith and spirituality. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the light within the truth and shadow. In the dimly lit chamber of the unknown, where faith dances on the edges of the abyss, I, BT, invite you to embark on a journey beyond the veil. In this interview, we dare to tread where the ethereal meets the tangible, where the whispers of ancient mysteries mingle with the echoes of modern science. Our guide, a sage seeker of truth, shall illuminate the enigmatic pathways forged by the elusive essence of Enthoegens. Let's welcome Christian maverick, apocalypse nonconformer, and your everyday friendly neighborhood kook, Kaleb. Thank you for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Really happy to be here with you.
As I'm delving into the idea of Enthoegens and the research involved in looking at the various hallucinatory substances, I came across your name and your website, psychedelictheology.com. And since I've read about your About page, I would like you to go ahead and tell the listeners who you are, education background, experience background, and then we can delve deep into your experiences.
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up in a Christian household, a very fundamentalist Christian household. Both of my grandfathers were Baptist preachers. And despite a somewhat prolonged period of agnosticism and atheism, I managed to re-enter my Baptist tradition and am a minister in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. I just finished last year with my Master of Divinity from Duke Divinity School, where I focused my study on psychedelics, but more broadly, the idea of dreams, visions, altered states of consciousness, and how they overlap with Christianity. So I've been really lucky to be on a number of podcasts, been published in some great sources, and I've really turned psychedelics into the primary topic of my ministry and of my academic research. I'm beginning a master's in psychology, and eventually, hopefully, I'm going to be going on to get my doctorate.
Wow, that's a whole lot of information packed into a very short synopsis.
Appreciate it.
And now we know that people have used psychedelics to commune with the divine and basically create bonds among the living and the dead, the spiritual and the natural worlds for centuries. What has been your background and what brought you into specifically looking into Enthoegens as an avenue of research?
Yeah, so psychedelics have been something that fascinated me since I was really young. Or I should say in general, drug use. I grew up in like I said, a fundamentalist Baptist background, which meant that virtually any sort of substance use outside of a daily cup of coffee was very taboo. I even remember sermons that were about energy drinks, like Monster energy drinks, and how these could be demonic. But as I moved away from Christianity for a short period of time and kept myself more on the agnostic and atheist side of things, I was reading more about alternative religious traditions and was really fascinated by what I found in undergrad studying religion about the ways in which peyote, which contains mescaline, or even marijuana and substances of that nature could affect the way that we read religious texts and the way that we experience religion. So in undergrad, I was in Colorado, a lot of access to cannabis. So I experimented with that, reading the Bible or reading the Nag Hammadi scriptures or things of that nature. But it wasn't until 2021, when the pandemic was in full swing. I was in seminary at Divinity School, but was doing it from home because of the lockdowns. And I was frankly just tremendously bored. I had been drinking far too much. I was smoking far too much weed. I think many of us had that experience of delving into what would be unhealthy substance use. And I was looking for something that might be an alternative, something that I could do that would be healthier for me, better for me, and also give me a different perspective on my life and my studies. And really, I was just curious. So I used psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, for the first time in May 2021, I believe it was. And it was just a really profound, life-changing experience. I wouldn't even say that first experience was spiritual or mystical or even really sacred, but I came out of it knowing that I needed to be a better spouse, a better person, and a better Christian. Um, and since then, I've experimented with a large number of substances in many trips: DMT, LSD, what I believe to be 2CB, MDMA, and then of course much more psilocybin or magic mushrooms.
Right. Yeah, and it's quite an interesting experience to have. I've not personally had any hallucinatory experiences with any kind of medication or drugs for that matter. But there are quite a bit of groups within the United States that use entheogen in their practices. There's several indigenous peoples, for example, that use peyote. There's a couple that are authorized to use ayahuasca during its ceremonies. And, you know, there's a couple of places, I guess even here in Oregon where I'm at, that there's a church that's actually legally allowed to use ayahuasca in the United States. So it's not, you know, as far-fetched as we usually think it is. There's some commonality of access to it. Specifically, what is it within the psilocybin, within entheogen specifically, that cause the brain, from your understanding, to enter into this heightened experience that you've participated in?
Sure. So looking at it more from a scientific angle, which I must say is not my area of expertise, though this is what I'm trying to fix, that it's not my area of expertise with my second master's. But as I understand it, there was a great article from two researchers, Elk and Yaden, that was published a few years back that gives a great overview of the ways that psychedelics affect the brain and the body and how it affects the mind as a result. And the best way of thinking about this would, one, be to remember that different substances do very different things. So there are some substances that might cause underactivity of certain parts of the brain, but other psychedelics would cause overactivity in the same parts of the brain. But what's most interesting, that seems to be pretty universal among these substances, is that parts of the brain that usually wouldn't talk to each other a lot more. So you might see parts of the brain that are about involuntary movement, talking to the parts of the brain that are involved with higher level consciousness and thinking, or visual and auditory perception. In a lot of ways, we've seen this particularly in research on DMT, it mirrors the experience of dreaming. So it's almost like if you're thinking about sleepwalking, you're asleep, but you're still experiencing, your body is still acting as if you are awake. It's almost the other side of the coin in that way, where your mind is asleep in some sense, participating in those really unusual ways that the brain talks to each other, while your body is still very much awake.
Right. And DMT is an interesting one itself, because DMT occurs naturally within the human brain. And there are everyday substances people consume that have minuscule amounts of the DMT product. But the thing is within the unless you can inhibit, or excuse me, when you inhibit the body's absorption of the DMT, nothing happens. And so when it comes to ayahuasca, this is specifically two very unique plants that have been combined in a unique way. And it seems no coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's DMT is such a fascinating example because it does occur very widely in natural substances, but your body metabolizes it almost instantly. So you do either have to smoke it, which goes straight to your brain within a matter of seconds. It doesn't have time to metabolize, but you'll have a trip that might last as little as 2 minutes. But like you said, you'd need something like an MAOI, an MAO inhibitor, that allows the DMT to stay in your body without being metabolized for longer, in order to have a longer DMT experience, which is, like you said, exactly what ayahuasca does.
And not only that, but government research has been using this for a long time to determine basically these same kind of experiences you speak about, Caleb, from the use of basically LSD to mescaline, and obviously manufactured DMT. But besides hallucinogens, changes in perception, things like distorted sense of time, you focus specifically on the spiritual experience.
Yeah, my first experiences with psychedelics, they weren't, I wouldn't call them spiritual in any way. They were fascinating, interesting, really, really just something that affected me, but I wouldn't say that it was spiritual in any way. Um, but that changed the more that I used the substance. And I'm not just talking about frequency, but the more trips that I had over a spread out period of time. And I think this is something that you'll see with a lot of people, is that when you're primed to believe that this is going to give you a spiritual experience, you're more likely to encounter what would be called a spiritual experience. And especially if we see it throughout pop culture, even listening to this present podcast, the way that people experience these substances is very much determined by what they expect from it. Um, Previous researchers have called psychedelics a non-specific amplifier of the human psyche. Um, but nonetheless, I do think even for people who might not expect a spiritual experience, I think eventually these substances do bring about spiritual experiences. Hmm, yeah, when I started really looking particularly at the ways in which people report encountering beings in psychedelic trips, these seem to be other entities, beings, something outside the person's own mind that was autonomous and nonetheless able to interact with them. These have been interpreted as elves or as angels or demons or any number of different explanations for what they're encountering. In one particular trip, I encountered something like a being myself that I've only been able to interpret as similar to the dancing Shiva of Hindu mythology and the imagery that it had. But I've interviewed people who said that they've met Jesus Christ, and that this encounter with a being they say was Jesus or an angel or something similar led them to convert to the Christian faith. And that's particularly what's affected me when doing my research, is making sure that people who are coming to spiritual communities looking for ways to interpret these experiences find people, spiritual leaders or congregants who are able to properly help them understand what they experienced.
See, this is what's an interesting topic, is if we look at it historically, there was an ancient Greek beverage, and I was looking at this, like I said, doing research into Enthoegens, and I found this ancient Greek beverage called kykeon, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But anyways, it was this ancient Greek drink that was most likely consumed by some of the earliest Christians, and it was made using basically, obviously wine, but they put barley or a form of like grains in it, and sometimes that grain would have been exposed to a parasite called ergot, and when you get ergot poison in the wine. And I find it really amusing because a lot of the Eleusinian mysteries as it comes down the pipeline, find out that this kykeon was regularly consumed as a ritual process to have these illusory or hallucinatory visions that became those particular mysteries. Entheogenic use has been part of human history as long as you can go back. It's all over the world, and there seems to be this underlying use of it. Like you said, it connects parts of the brain. So is the human mind so shut off from the other side of the veil that consumption of an entheogen opens them up to seeing that there's more to life?
Well, it's really... I tend to be very agnostic about the nature of the visions that people have, or the experiences they have, not only with these beings, but claiming that they've been to heaven or to hell, or meeting people that have died, especially close family members. But at the same time, I am agnostic about what this exactly means. But at the same time, there are numerous examples that I've run across of what seems to be evidence that these experiences are more than just hallucinations. And this is something that is hinted at by some of the researchers over the years, like Rick Strassman from University of New Mexico or William Richards from Johns Hopkins. These little experiences that, again, can't be rationally explained away. One example of this that I've come across that was really fascinating was a psychedelic researcher from the 1960s who led the Good Friday experiment, which was when seminary students were given psilocybin. And this researcher's name was Walter Pahnke. Unfortunately, later in life, Dr. Pahnke died suddenly in a scuba diving accident. It was completely unexpected. But Dr. Pahnke's wife decided to try to have an LSD experience to see if she could come to terms with the grief that she was experiencing, especially after such a sudden and tragic death. And what she saw was, she claimed she saw Dr. Pahnke approach her in the LSD trip and tell her she's going to be okay, all will be well, she doesn't have to worry about the rest of her life, she'll be able to move on and find happiness, all the things that we'd like to hear from somebody who's moved on. But right before Pahnke left in this vision, Walter Pahnke told his wife, Eva, that he needed her to do him a favor. And in this vision, according to Eva, Walter left her instructions about returning a book to a friend that he had borrowed before his death. The instructions were complete with the book's location in their home's attic, its exact location on a bookshelf, the title, and the owner's name. And despite reportedly having no prior knowledge of this tome, Eva was able to find and return that book exactly as the psychedelic vision of Walter had described. There are literally dozens of these sorts of experiences that I've come across where, unless you want to say that this is outright fraud, this would seem to be evidence that there is something very real about these experiences, and experiencing someone on the other side of that veil, as the language that you used. But yes, I do believe, even if I'm agnostic about most experiences, I do believe that it may be possible that we are experiencing a spiritual reality using these substances.
You regularly give talks at different churches, and what are some of those talking points that you leave your audience with, that you can leave obviously with my audience, about the use of an entheogen and being Christian?
Yeah, this is a topic that I'm hoping to spend a little bit more time trying to get a book out sometime this summer, because I think what I want most Christians to know is not particularly not particularly information, though that's obviously very important, but more principles of wisdom that can be used to apply to these substances, whether it's the one who's experiencing these substances or the people who are helping the person using these substances integrate it into their life. The number one thing I want people to think about is set and setting. This is part of harm reduction, and it refers to the setting in which someone uses the substance, the physical place in which they use it, and also their mindset, where their head's at when they chose to use these substances. Frankly, this is a great principle to have throughout our lives, that our physical surroundings and our mindset determine a lot of our experience. So I want to remind people, if they're ever thinking about using these substances, to make sure they're in a safe place, that they have tested these substances to make sure that they're not laced with fentanyl or something dangerous, that they're actually the substance that they've been given access to, that it's been dosed correctly, that they're somewhere where they're safe, whether that's their home or in a medical setting, with people they trust, whether that's a friend, family member, or doctor, and also that they've done the work beforehand to make sure they're in a good headspace for this. Psychedelics are known for being able to treat depression and anxiety. So it's not necessarily about being happy when you take this, but feeling confident, feeling ready, feeling grounded, maybe doing some mindfulness exercises beforehand that help make this experience better. And then when it comes to what we can do during and after the experience, I really think about, I believe it's 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul talks about his experience going into the third heaven. And the one thing that Paul says that's most important is humility. That we don't come down from an experience or walk away from a psychedelic experience or any visionary or hallucinatory experience and think that this experience has made us special somehow. The attitude we should have going into it and our interpretation afterwards should always be one of humility, that we have been granted something wonderful, or that we have been taught something more honest about ourselves or the way we should be living. And that's what I want people to remember coming out of the psychedelic experience and while in it, is just humility. Seek out advice, seek out counsel. Don't let this make you think you're particularly special. You're part of a much grander narrative of which we're only a small part.
Each individual's experience, each individual's understanding and conscious mind needs to play a major aspect into what they do with their own bodies, because I believe in a form of bodily autonomy. Each individual needs to really address themselves, whether they should be consuming psilocybin or other forms of entheogens. We're told, don't consume an entheogenic drug or entheogenic substance, and then we're finding people who are doing things like the use of psilocybin and finding out that it's helping people with severe cases of autism. What do you think the future of, psychedelic research would be for individuals who have a morality that has been shaped by taboos? Where would they go with this information as it becomes more available?
Yeah, I appreciate bringing this up, because my ministry is not just for Christians. It's for people who also have Christian experiences, even if they are not Christian. Like I mentioned, I've had experiences of what seemed to be a Hindu deity, even though I'm very, very much a Christian. So when we're talking about the psychedelic community or the psychedelic subculture, there's a lot of wisdom and there's a lot of information that's been built up over the years from people who have taken these substances, told their stories, so that we can be safer when we use these substances. So the first thing that we should always think about is physical safety. Like I said, set and setting, very, very important to make sure you're in a safe place and that your mind is ready for what is truly some of the most powerful substances on the planet. But beyond that, too, thinking about, like you said, should people uh, take these substances? There are some people who should not. One study that was from MAPS, which is a psychedelic research organization, found that about 7% of people who took MDMA in a therapeutic setting experienced more suicidal ideation than before they went through it. And there was a similar study, I believe it was from Johns Hopkins, that found a similar number for psilocybin, that around 7% of people who took these substances ended up feeling more suicidal ideation, for some of them for the first time after the experience than before it. So, some ways to really think about, is this substance right for me? Is one, are you in therapy? Are you already trying to get treatment in a non chemical fashion? Have you made changes in your life to try to address some of these problems? Um, and beyond that, do you have a good support network? Are you just going to get dropped off at home without family to talk to, or a church or other religious community to support you? Or do you have people who can help you walk through what you experienced and how your life needs to change? Moreover, thinking again more about safety physically, people who are on certain medications, particularly lithium, but also some sorts of SSRIs or SNRIs, antidepressants or anti anxiety medications, and especially antipsychotic medication, need to think about whether or not there's going to be any interaction for them. People who have a family history of bipolar psychosis, schizophrenia, or similar things should also probably steer clear. Um, but again, more broadly, I think what people really need to think about when it comes to choosing, is this right for them, is to do a lot of research on the substance that they're going to be using on their own terms. Make sure that this is a safe, special place with people who might have some experience guiding you through it. And in general, just make sure that you feel like you have the wisdom necessary to go on this journey. It is beautiful, but it is truly impossible to describe the psychedelic experience to someone who has not gone through it. And it can be absurdly painful, facing past traumas that you would rather forget. This is part of the healing process, but if you're not prepared for that, if you haven't taken the time to get ready, it can almost feel like taking apart your psyche, but now you're not ready, or don't have the resources or support network to put it back together again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I use, for the listener, I use terms like entheogen. That's the psychedelic ones that Kaleb is mostly speaking about. And then he brought up MDA. MDA are in a classification known as empathogens. So instead of ethnogen, it's empathogen. Basically, it's a drug that's kind of like a psychostimulant within the amphetamine family. I think MDA is in the amphetamine family,
Yeah,
but
it's
it's yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry. No, I was just going to say, yeah, this is actually a great point, that a lot of these substances are, some of them are classified as psychedelics, but they're sort of in a gray area where they do different things to the brain than other substances would. Ketamine is another great example of this. Commonly called psychedelic, but it has similar outcomes, and it does similar things to the brain, particularly when it comes to something called the default mode network and its association with depression. But yeah, you're not going to get a lot of these visionary experiences on MDMA that you would on like LSD or psilocybin.
Right. Yeah, because the use of MDA, they classify it basically as I think it's a serotonin, uh, dopamine releasing agent. So basically, the body's being flooded with extra levels of serotonin, extra levels of dopamine, and both of those, can do funky things depending on a person's brain chemistry, as they said already. And that's what we're discovering. We're finding out that some people's brains are not really designed to handle an MDA to help them in their situation. Others can take something like psilocybin or LSD to help them establish connections between the brain. And And these are all just really curious things. And then the side effects of those psychoactive drugs is hallucinogens or feelings of euphoria, a sense of oneness, a sense of connection. And they're not all spiritual in the same sense that we would call it spiritual experiences, but they are something that people like you, Kaleb, are exploring, right?
Absolutely. And I think since we're on the topic of, how it affects the brain specifically, another thing that makes these substances really good therapeutically, but also means that you need to use them wisely, is that they induce something in the brain called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is basically when you're a kid, or when you're a little kid, even up to a teenager or a young adult, your brain is constantly making new connections. It's trying to figure out how it talks with itself, down to those little tiny synapses that we have. As you get older, and I think a lot of people can experience this, as our fluid intelligence turns to crystallized intelligence, there's less neuroplasticity in older adults. But because psychedelics can induce neuroplasticity, this is a great opportunity to mold the brain a little better into healthier modes of being. So if you're someone who, I think this is particularly why it works great for treating addiction. Addiction is one of the best things psychedelics can treat. Is if you have the same neural pathways that are just going off over and over and over and over again, whether that's for gambling, drinking, drug use, this can be a unique opportunity where your brain can be better molded by your community, by your family, by your friends, by new habits, by therapies, to make it easier for you to kick whatever addiction you might have. But by the same token, if you're not in a place with a good support network, if you're not ready to actually work with these newfound ways of thinking, it can make it really difficult for you to put life back together again, or to know what to do with all of these new ways of interacting with yourself. So yeah, that's a great example of how down on the chemical level, this is how it affects the brain. And this is how it can affect us on a personality or a social level, from top to bottom. All of these different ways that psychedelics affect us all work together.
When we talk or read about other individuals who have personal experiences, I talk a lot on the fringes, the fringe science community, and this is where we have people like Graham Hancock, who talk about utilizing ayahuasca and having experiences that have led him from one path into a different one that he feels a little bit more aligned with. But the things that I find really interesting is the consistency of speaking about specific entities that form within the psychedelic experience that are, oddly enough, substance related. You don't hear about clockwork gnomes when someone takes psilocybin, for example. You do if they take ayahuasca. You don't hear about Mother Earth spirits in this one, and so on and so forth. Let's talk about these kinds of experiences that other people have had, and how we, as maybe as Christians, we need to navigate that.
Sure. So it's interesting. It's not just entities. It's also I don't know if you'd call them like psychic dimensions, planes of existence, whatever you'd like to call them. It's also places that seem to be substance specific. So I was just researching recently Salvia divinorum, which is an opioid-based psychedelic, interestingly enough. Can't cause addiction, but touches on those same neuroreceptors. And independently, in research studies, subjects have repeatedly said that they've been in something like a carnival or a circus, despite not talking to each other. So this would seem to indicate that for particular substances, you're more likely to encounter a specific type of place than you would be on other substances. But at the same time, I think we have been led to believe, based on our expectations, we've been led to believe that we're going to experience certain things on certain substances. So, for instance, there are plenty of examples of people who have met entities on LSD, psilocybin, those sorts of things, but they are much more commonly experienced with DMT. I think that's partially because people are told they're going to experience entities on DMT. They expect it. It's what the substance is best known for. But nonetheless, I do think that some substances are more likely to induce these sorts of experiences, DMT definitely being one of them. One of the experiences that I think about a lot when it comes to DMT entities is a story told by the comedian Shane Mouse, who is also a psychedelics educator, really funny guy who's working with MAPS right now, which I mentioned before is a psychedelic research organization that is trying to get MDMA, and has gotten MDMA, into the mainstream of research and psilocybin for treating depression, anxiety, etc. But Shane describes this experience where he challenged the DMT entities that he was experiencing to show him that they were something more than just creations of his own mind. And so on his next DMT experience, he was taken to this, like, he describes it as a galactic carnival. And there were all of these weird rides and games and experiences all around him. And he met this purple woman who he said he had known in previous lifetimes or things of that nature. And when he came down, he didn't think much of it. But a friend of his, when he took DMT, told Mouse that he was in a carnival very similar to the one Mouse had experienced, and that there was a purple woman there who wanted to tell Mouse that she loved him. What's interesting is that Mouse says that he never told his friend about this experience. It's something that he had kept private, and yet his friend had an experience almost identical to his own. Which again indicates to me that there may be something more to these substances beyond just hallucinations in our heads. What that is, again, very agnostic on the subject. But one of the ways that I think Christians can understand this, because you're right, people have New Age experiences, Buddhist experiences, UFO religion experiences, all these different ways of experiencing psychedelics that seem very different than the Christian mode of being. And I think this is partially because Christians in the modern world have developed a very impoverished cosmology. If you're Catholic, you might have, heaven, hell, purgatory, and the earthly realm. If you're a progressive Christian, you might just end up with heaven and earth, and you've gotten rid of hell and all those things. But for most of Christian history, Christian cosmology has been full of imagination, full of different realms that were conjectured. And one thing that I saw very particularly was in St. Augustine's writings about the mind and the soul and the way that spiritual realms interact with human realms. He describes similar experiences where someone had a dream. He heard of someone who had a dream of visiting a friend at their house, and this friend claimed that he saw this friend in his house. So St. Augustine believed that this was evidence of a sort of psychic realm, that we all have this psyche that can travel through some other dimension, I guess is the best way to describe it, and go to different places. And so we could experience each other in our dreams if our psychic minds happen to interact with each other. I don't know of any Christians today who have really interacted with Augustine's psychic realm in the ways that it creates a broader Christian cosmology. Other early Christian sources also talk about, like, the Shepherd of Hermas, places like Arcadia, which is, if you read the text the way I do and other commentators have, is a real place, but also a dream state where when you dream, you physically travel to these new locations. Other ancient writers like Josephus also indicate this, that your soul independently travels to other worlds, other locations while you're asleep. Um, in the Apocalypse of Isaiah, same thing. Isaiah's mind, even while his body is on earth, his mind is catapulted into the heavens to experience God's heaven. So, one of the things I think Christians need to start thinking about is, how can we build a broader cosmology where we might be able to interpret these experiences in very orthodox ways if we're willing to dig deeper into the Christian tradition of cosmology to discover these other places in the heavens that we haven't, and earth and below, that we have completely forgotten in the modern world. So instead of automatically jumping, as Shane does, to this idea of interdimensional traveling beings that are sort of like UFOology almost, we can instead really dive into the breadth and the depth and the beauty of the Christian tradition as it is, to realize that we inherit a really bizarre, wild way of understanding the world as Christians, and it can give us a lot of resources to understand the broad, wild, bizarre world of psychedelics as well.
A whole lot of stuff to think about, especially considering, where we are, as Americans, and, what are, the baggage that we have from previous generations have accumulated. If when we look back at, some ideas, our grandparents would definitely scold on something. Marijuana use, for example, is heavily scolded on, and it still is, looked down upon. We still use terms like pothead and things like that as derogatory terms. And the idea that the brain can be manipulated with plants, obviously created. We cannot deny the fact that they're here and they've been created by, our creator God. And when we look at that fact, we realize that these are here, and that we know that plants have been used for medicinal purposes for millennia. And we still use medicinal plants to this day to help certain treatments. Um, I can think that, there's a plant that we regularly grow in the garden for flowers. It's got big old flower stalks, shoots up out of the middle of the plant. But oddly enough, the roots of that plant are used for controlling people's blood pressure. And it's common. I mean, it's a common knowledge thing that plants have been used to help medically treat people. We also know that plants have been used to negative and detrimental effects. Same plant that's used to help blood pressure when overdose experience, when you take too much of it, it will kill you, plain and simple. That means dosing is the key. And, for you, Kaleb, there's a debate on psilocybin microdosing, DMT microdosing, and these ideas being explored in a scientific research avenue. Should we look at that more seriously? What are your thoughts, ideas, feelings about the idea of microdosing as an option for dealing with individuals who may be suffering from any form of a mental disorder, from ADHD, autism, and beyond?
Sure. It often surprises people to learn that I do not support microdosing. It's not something that I think is a good idea for most people. And this is based both on my personal thoughts about these substances, but also the data that's come out recently. So just to use an easy example, microdosing is usually with magic mushrooms. The use of maybe a tenth of a gram of magic mushrooms on some sort of regular schedule. That might be once a week, every day for a week, once a month, something along those lines. And what we found in studies is that, and granted, these are early studies, so not the sort of thing that closes the debate altogether. But what we've seen is that there's no significant change in symptoms for people struggling with depression based on whether they've been microdosing or working with a placebo. Beyond that, we also see that consistently activating the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the serotonin receptor that most classical psychedelics work on. Consistent use can actually lead to heart disease, and it's rather significant heart disease. So, with heart disease being one of the number one killers of people in America, this might not be so much of a cure as something that causes more trouble down the line. And finally, the third reason I really don't suggest microdosing, and this goes for, I just was talking with a pastor recently who asked the same thing, is this something that could be accepted? Christians throughout our history have been given the ethic of sort of everything in moderation, almost. That's the way we've talked about alcohol with like, well, you can drink, but you can't get wasted. Or, yeah, you can smoke pot, but you shouldn't be absolutely blazed or something like that. But that's not the way these substances work. It is the visionary experience and the level of neuroplasticity created during them that is the tool, is the key to creating therapeutic results. So when we have done studies even on moderate amount of psilocybin versus high amounts every single time are what leads to the most therapeutic benefit. So I just don't think microdosing is going to get the effect that most people want. It is worth saying, for instance, when you look at seems unrelated, but I promise it's not, back pain and chiropractics. We really don't know most of the time what causes back pain in most people. It's such a complex problem. It's psychological, it's physical, it's muscle, bone, nerve, all these things. For a small number of people with back pain, chiropractics works wonders, and we do know this scientifically. But for a lot of people, it does absolutely nothing. This is because we don't have the proper diagnostic nuance for most back pain. We just go, okay, back pain of unknown origin, try all these different things, throw things against the wall, see what sticks. In the same way, I wonder if that's the same for depression and anxiety in particular, which are the number one problems people use psychedelics for. Where there could be a large number of different types of depression or anxiety with different etiologies, different causes that we have not been able to identify yet. So for a small subsection of people, it may be true that the psychedelic microdosing can help with their depression or anxiety, even if it doesn't help for the majority of people. And this is also what you see with SSRIs, SNRIs, different antidepressant medication. You just kind of have to go through the gamut of different antidepressants, and for some people, none of them work. For some people, the first one works. For some people, it's the fourth or fifth try, and we really don't know why. So, what I would tell people is like, if you really want to try microdosing, again, that's your choice. I believe in bodily autonomy as well, but I would much more strongly suggest the full dose experience. But I'm also open to the possibility that in 5, 10, 20 years, we learn that microdosing helps with a subsection of the population that hasn't been identified yet.
Yeah, and as we draw to a close, entheogens themselves often do occasion these mystical type experiences. And the really interesting thing is about 2/3 around of those who participate in the research studies, they find that these mystical type experiences remain important and even meaningful to them for months, up to a year and beyond, to years, important to them. And so I think that there's something there that can really be looked at. Like you said, Kaleb, early on, that you had an experience that taught you how to be a better person, a more wholesome person, as, not just as a man, but as obviously as a spouse, as a husband. And that development itself is probably worth an honest shake.
I think that's entirely right. I really do. I'm very cautious with these substances, but truly, they are some of the most beautiful, wonderful things in the world. It creates a sort of somatic knowledge that I really think is unparalleled. I suffered a lot of abuse as a child in a fundamentalist upbringing. And coming back to the faith, I intellectually knew Jesus loved me. I intellectually knew that I was, made in the image of God. I intellectually knew that I was on the right path, but it still hurt in the body, right? The body keeps score. And I had one particular experience on LSD that just broke me, where I was shown all of my past memories of when I had been abused or kicked down or hurt or discouraged, and how God was with me in each moment to keep me strong, to keep me alive in many instances, and to keep me moving forward. And after that experience, I knew not just in my brain, not just in my mind, my intellect, but in my body, that I was loved, that I was wanted, that there was a purpose for my life. It is really hard to get that sort of somatic knowledge into your body, that love into your very knitted being, through talk therapy or through years and years of church. It can happen. But for many people who have especially experienced trauma, this can be a way to do overnight what it would require 20 years of therapy otherwise.
Can you tell the audience where to find you, what you have coming up this fall, etc.?
Yeah, I consistently put out episodes on my podcast, Psychedelic Theology, which is on Spotify, Apple, the normal ones where you can find it. I routinely speak at churches, and if anybody listening is ever interested in having me speak at their church, whether that's in Zoom distance format or in person, I'd love to hear from you. But I'm also going to be hopefully putting out some new articles, trying to get a new book out somewhere. So yeah, just keep looking at social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Reddit to see what I've got coming up. And if you're ever interested in this topic, even if we've never spoken before, I'm always happy to point people in directions to help them integrate their experience, prepare for their first experience. I really do see this as a ministry, and that people need to be given the resources to experience these things in a healthy and productive manner.
And we can find you at psychedelictheology.com.
Yes, definitely. You can always send me a message there or email me at psychedelictheology@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Kaleb. I really appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.